Not surprisingly, the threat of tariffs and the impact they could have on the economy have been top of mind for Canadians. And over the last few days, we have heard from party leaders about plans and concerns. Here is just a sampling of what's been shared, beginning with that late-night news conference with the Prime Minister last Saturday night.
I'm sure many of you are anxious, but I want you to know we are all in this together. The Canadian government, Canadian businesses, Canadian organized labor, Canadian civil society, Canada's premiers, and tens of millions of Canadians from coast to coast to coast are aligned and united.
But in 9 years, the NDP Liberals have lost control of our borders, letting drugs, guns, and terrorists threaten our people. Part is incompetence, but part is the radical Liberal agenda, a borderless, globalist, post-national agenda.
Our first thought is we have to put in place better protections for these workers. These workers should not be left on their own. They should know that there's a government there for them. And as Prime Minister, as a New Democratic leader, the party leader, and my team, we are going to make sure we do everything possible to protect these workers. One of the things we need is a better EI that better protects workers.
Well, to react to all this, we're now joined by our political panel. Daniele Medlej is a former Director of Communications to a Liberal Minister, now Senior Consultant at Navigator. Cole Hogan, a Conservative Digital Strategist, Principal at GT. And George Soule, a former Director of Communications with the federal NDP, joining us today from Oshawa, Ontario, where he is managing a local campaign for the Ontario NDP as the province is right now in the midst of an election campaign. George, nice to see you, and nice to see both of you here in studio as well.
Good to see you, Michael.
So a bit of a sampling of what we heard from the party leaders over these last few days, ever since Donald Trump, threatened us with those 25% tariffs as of last Saturday, February the 1st. What do you make of what we have heard from the party leaders thus far? Danielle, I'll get you to start.
Absolutely. Well, number one, I think what we heard from the Prime Minister is the message that Canadians needed to hear. It's a unifying message. It is Canadians standing together. There's a common threat happening right now to our economy, to our livelihoods, to our prosperity, and that's something that we should be taking on together. Now, unfortunately, what we heard from the Leader of the Opposition was the complete opposite. It was partisanship. It was painting Canada in an era of weakness, in an era of division, something that Canadians are not looking for right now. We're looking for a unified front. We've seen national pride rise in this country by 9% this week alone. This is not the message that Canadians are waiting for, and it's unfortunate that we're not seeing this across the board from all parties.
Cool.
Yeah, I watched the speech that the Prime Minister gave on Saturday. I think it was interesting for a few reasons, because he said he was speaking to Americans, but he wasn't really speaking to Americans, was he? He was speaking to Canadians watching him speak to Americans. So there was a different audience and intention there. So I look at him and I think that it was nice. I'll give the Prime Minister some credit. It was a good tactic for him to remind the Americans all the times that Canadians have been there for him, or for them, I should say. But I don't think that Americans were really listening, or this particularly landed. And I think, premiers like Doug Ford have been a much better communicator for Canada's economic message than the Prime Minister has. And I look also at the $155 billion in tariffs that were announced on things like orange juice, wine, beer, vegetables. I think that lacks in a comparison to the more detailed plan on interprovincial trade that we saw Pierre Poilievre come forward with.
Mm-hmm. George, what do you make of what we heard from the three main federal leaders?
Well, look, I think, good on the Prime Minister for finding a voice and trying to be, the leader that he probably should have been for a while now. I do think that since he's quit, it's a bit of a confusing message. And I think both for Canadians and Americans and those he's negotiating with, he's lost a lot of credibility just because everyone knows that he's a lame duck and he's walking away. I do think that for the government, it might be stronger to let someone like Dominic LeBlanc or something, take the lead. But nevertheless, and I do think you got to give some credit because, you never know what Donald Trump's plans are. But obviously, we did get a 30-day reprieve from the tariff. So, something was happening that worked out well. I think the biggest thing now is we need nobody to take a victory dance. And we also need to make sure that everybody's focused. It's good to see all the party leaders talking about this topic, at least right now. But when the tariffs come, one, we need to push back hard, but two, as Jagmeet was saying today, we need to make sure that supports are there as well. Sitting here in Oshawa, even this is a town that will get hit hard if GM feels the need to pull out because of tariffs, for instance. And the same as can be said for Windsor and other places across the province and the country. So I think on top of that fight, we need to be ready to really support both workers, but also just entire communities for the damage that could be done if this trade war happens. And I think that's what's missing from both Mr. Polyev and Mr. Trudeau, and that's why I'm glad to see that Jagmeet talked about that today.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly does go to a lot of economic fears of Canadians if this 25% tariff and 10% on energy actually goes through from Washington. Makes me wonder, though, because we're now in the midst of this 30-day pause. By the time it is over, we'll just be days away from a new Liberal leader, days away from essentially a new Prime Minister. How does Donald Trump and the threats we're hearing from Washington change that race, Danielle?
I think it changes it completely. I think what Canadians are looking for is a leader who's going to take charge and who's not going to create animosity within the Canadian populace, who's going to put Canadians first in a way that doesn't put Canadians behind in another way. He's not going to give tax breaks to the wealthiest and put the middle class behind. He's not going to mix things up in a way that really amplifies narratives that we're hearing from the South that don't really translate into real issues that we're seeing in Canada. What we've seen is a president who is really starting an issue with a country that was never on the radar for Americans, and now we're seeing a prime minister that's putting it back on the radar in the right way. And so that's what the next leader needs to do. They need to pick up the slack from where things have been. They need to pick up the torch from where Trudeau has left it. But at the same time, we need consistency. And what I don't see, unfortunately, across the board is consistency. I am glad to hear Mr. Singh, for example, speak about workers. That's something that the Prime Minister has really addressed directly by putting Mr. Youssef on the Council of Canada-U.S. Relations, who is advising him directly on our approach to the United States. So he used to be the Canadian Labour Congress's president, and now he's advising the Prime Minister, and he has done a lot working with the Prime Minister and the government to fight for workers. But now we're seeing this translate directly in the fight with America.
Well, it's interesting because I asked about the leadership, but you've switched over essentially into the next general election, and that is, I think that is also a question that many people are asking. Cole, does the next federal election change because of Donald Trump? Because up until this point, it has been about carbon tax and affordability, but it's now all about economic survivability and what's happening in the White House.
Yeah, I don't think it changes the ballot question much. I think Trump and tariffs will be a large part of that conversation. But when I look at the issues, like when Canadians are polled, what issue they rank most important to them, the cost of living is first, and Trump is about 6th or 7th. And granted, that's probably come up a bit in terms of the scoring. Maybe it's 3rd or 4th now, but tariffs still speak to economic issues on which conservatives are still trusted more than any other party to deal with. Conservatives are trusted most to deal with, crime, immigration, jobs, the economy, and on Trump. So even if the election does shift to Trump, most Canadians trust conservatives to deal with him more than any other party.
Okay, George, what do you say to that? How does Donald Trump change the next federal election?
Well, I think it brings some substance to the conversation, right? I mean, some of this has been talked about already, but I think that the ability for the Conservatives to just run on the any 3-word slogans that they've been doing, or the idea of Canada's broken and we need to fix it. Like the pride, I mean, it brought up earlier, the pride that people are feeling in our country, we're not necessarily comfortable all the time with a whole lot of patriotism. And so Canadians are finding interesting ways to voice that, but it's there. And so having, people won't necessarily want to run to a party that says that Canada's broken in the same way that they would have been more comfortable with that even just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I think as well, with the tariffs, I'm not saying that the ballot question is going to be, are you for or against tariffs? But I think what it does do is bring some substance to that conversation about affordability. It forces folks to kind of have a bit more of an understanding of how the big E economy works. And I think the other thing it's going to do is really, really focus the mind for people, depending on where we're at, on jobs. I mean, if we are in a situation where tens of thousands of people are losing their jobs because of the tariff war, I mean, that's going to fundamentally shift how an election goes. And it's going to be people are going to be looking for what party's going to be there to have their backs, rather than just who's going to be able to give them, 15 cents off their next grocery trip.
Now, Cole, we don't have a lot of time, but without a doubt, we've been talking about this huge conservative lead in terms of numbers over the Liberals in more than a year now. But again, Donald Trump becomes a bit of a game changer to what's happening here in Canada. We're now going to have a new leader in terms of the Liberals and a new Prime Minister, because that will essentially be what happens. Do you see the numbers at all changing quickly because of what's happening with Donald Trump?
I don't. I still think the cost of living concerns are top of mind for Canadians, and Trump will consume a lot of oxygen. But when I look at the Liberal leadership race and Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney saying, forget the last 9 years, we didn't mean any of that stuff, we're not going to do any of it, there's a lack of consistency in messaging. And when I look to the Conservative side, and I look at just the last 14 policy proposals that Pierre has put forward, which are pretty straightforward in terms of interprovincial trade, we're talking about a standardized set of trucking rules so we can move goods east-west instead of north-south, the standardized Blue Seal licensing so doctors, engineers, nurses can practice their trade across the country. These are practical, real solutions, and there's some policy meat to chew on for Canadians.
Okay. Well, that is all the time we have for this week, but I really appreciate the conversation today. So Danielle, Cole, George, thank you. Thank you for my old hometown in Oshawa. Thank you for joining us.